Hi, everyone. All right. So today we're continuing with Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And we're talking about self consciousness, uh, his famous section on Lordship and Bondage. And we'll talk a little bit about reason also. Uh, and these are difficult sections. I think, in particular, the section on self consciousness is difficult. And um, some of the big ideas in this section on self consciousness have to do with the nature of life, concepts of essence, uh, and the relationship between the I to itself and the I to another I. So, what's really happening in the section on self consciousness is the elaboration of the way the notion uh, relates to the world, relates to life. Uh, the notion, you remember, is that which is produced as a result of sense certainty, as a result of the initial dialectical movement between consciousness for itself and consciousness in itself, right? Movement between consciousness of the object uh, as sensation, as perception, and consciousness of the object as idea, right? Where the notion, the idea, is derived from that sense certainty, consciousness of the object, and is about the object. Right? Now, self consciousness is the knowledge that the notion, the idea, is the truth of the external thing, of the object. Self consciousness arises when, uh, when consciousness, right, returns to itself, examines the certainty of its sensory experience, uh, and understands that that certainty is raised to a higher level uh, through the understanding, through the idea, that the idea gives truth to the external thing, and that that truth is higher than the sense certainty that we get just through sensation, right? So, consciousness uh, for itself perceives the object, has sense certainty of about the object, uh, right? It then, right, moves to another object. Uh, I turn my consciousness from consciousness of this to consciousness of that. And in that turning, right, my sense certainty about the external object is negated, and I have sense certainty about some other object. I then return my consciousness to the first object, the first this. Again, my consciousness of sense certainty is negated, right? No longer am I certain of the that, I'm now certain again of the this. But I have now two different moments of self certainty about this same this, my first object. And in that return, when I have two moments of self-certainty, of sense certainty about the same external object, I discover that that object has a permanence and a being that is continuous, regardless of whether or not I am consciously attending to it or not. That the being of that external thing, uh, is more than what I simply grasp through my senses, is more than I find in mere sense certainty. Uh, so I then move beyond sense certainty to the mere consciousness of the object, and right, realize that uh, what lies beyond sense certainty is a kind of truth about the object. And that truth is not found in in sense certainty itself, but rather in the idea that unifies the many moments of sense certainty I have about that object. And the idea, the notion, is not itself found in sense certainty, but is in fact uh, not consciousness for itself, right? Consciousness of the object, of the external this, but is consciousness in itself, right? It is the notion, the idea of the thing that gives it a truth that is higher than sense certainty, so that the external object, the this, becomes what it is uh, as right idea, no longer as sense certainty, but as idea. Its truth is found in the idea, and the idea is found in consciousness in itself, not consciousness for itself. This consciousness in itself, then, recognizes that the truth of the external this, of the thing, uh, is derived from consciousness, not from uh, the external thing. Right? And so, this consciousness in itself, which is the notion of the truth of the this, of the external thing, is that consciousness that gives rise to self-consciousness, right? Because what I recognize is that it is consciousness itself, consciousness in itself, that provides truth to the external this. Recognizing that, I become aware of consciousness itself. Consciousness becomes aware of itself. It becomes self-conscious with the recognition that it is consciousness that provides this truth. Now, that self-consciousness, which is consciousness aware of itself as the seat of truth, only comes on the scene, as Hegel says, with the recognition of another self-consciousness. And I find this to be sort of the most difficult part of this section on self-consciousness, which is the relationship between different moments of self-consciousness within a single consciousness. Right? As I said, there are sort of two parts to this discussion of self-consciousness. The first has to do with self-consciousness relating to itself within a single self-consciousness, within a single thinking subject. And the second part has to do with self-consciousness dealing with itself, dealing with uh, the self-consciousness of another thinking subject, a different person. And we'll start with, as Hegel does, self-consciousness in a single thinking subject. That self-consciousness arises in the recognition of another self-consciousness. I think the idea here is that self-consciousness arises in consciousness all at once, so that in that moment where consciousness returns to itself and realizes that it is itself the cause of truth in the external thing, uh, it realizes that every moment of consciousness is also self-consciousness. Right? That consciousness becomes self-consciousness through uh, this initial completion of self-consciousness, where you know you can't have one moment of self-consciousness. As soon as you have one moment of self-consciousness, all moments of consciousness become moments of self-consciousness. Right? It is uh, the raising of the entire meaning of consciousness. So let's look at a few sections from page 104, section 166, in self-consciousness, the first page of this, the truth of self-certainty. Right? Hegel writes, in the previous modes of certainty, what is true for consciousness is something other than itself. But the notion of this truth vanishes in the experience of it. And so certainty uh, is something other than itself. Mode of certainty, what is true is something other than consciousness, right? The external thing is true. But the notion of this truth vanishes in the experience of it. What the object immediately was in itself, mere being in sense certainty, the concrete thing of perception and for understanding of force, proves to be in truth not this at all. Right? The object immediately was in itself, right, becomes no longer the seat of truth. Right? We think truth lies externally to us, and that consciousness is grasping the truth of the external thing. But this quickly falls apart. Right? Instead, this in itself, right, where truth lies, turns out to be a mode in which the object is only for another. Right? That the object isn't true in itself, rather, the truth of the object uh, is for consciousness, for me, the observer. The notion of the object is superseded in the actual object, where the first immediate presentation of the object is superseded in experience. That the object is not what it is. Right? The object exceeds its notion, exceeds its certainty. Right? When I discover more about it, when I test my notion against it, it exceeds itself. Uh, and in doing so, right, it shows that that truth that consciousness is satisfied with in sense certainty uh, is not an absolute truth. It's not a truth derived from the external thing itself, but is a truth, as we discussed a few videos ago, that is satisfied by consciousness itself. The consciousness reveals itself to be the truth, the truth that the truth about the object. And that notion that is mere sense certainty uh, is superseded by further consciousness of the object. Uh, and then Hegel writes, certainty gives place to truth. So, what happens when the object supersedes its notion? When my first impression, my first sense certainty about the object uh, is revealed to not be the entire truth of the object, the absolute meaning of the object, but that the object and my consciousness of the object supersede that initial sense certainty, is that certainty gives place to truth, gives rise to a higher concept of truth, right? Truth that resides in consciousness, uh, is found in consciousness in itself. And he says, what arises in this is a certainty which is identical with its truth. That certainty now is not sense certainty, not certainty that resides on the side of the object and sensory experience, but certainty in the abstract, right, in the idea. Uh, no longer do I say, right, the object is right um, red, uh, because I know at night it will be black. Right? I know that the color changes with the light. That every time I go back to test my notion of the object against the experience of the object, that my notion and conception of it will change. Right? That one notion will be negated. The thing is red. Well, I come back to it at night and it's no longer red. Right? It's dark. But I can still touch it and I can still see it in some sense. It still exists. Its meaning exceeds the notion. And I now grasp it as not a red thing, but as an object that has varying properties, varying qualities. I grasp it abstractly, and I'm certain of that abstract idea of it in a different way, right? I'm certain now of the idea, not of the sense impression itself. And in this, right, certainty rises to a higher level. I transcend, I supersede that first certainty. So this is, I quoted this in class, but we'll mention it again. If we give the name of notion to the movement of knowing, and the name of object to knowing as a passive unity, or as the I, then we see that not only for us, but for knowing itself, the object corresponds to the notion. Right? Now, the object corresponds to the notion. The thing is a thing. The thing is this abstract object that has many varying and changing properties. The I, that thing which apprehends the differences that run through the unity of the object, is now identical to the unity of the object itself, right? In that the I and the object are both abstractions that synthesize and unify these many differences. So the object is now commensurate with consciousness that is the I, and that is the truth and the certainty of the truth. Now, this then sets up, right, this higher level of truth that is found through self-consciousness. And my consciousness, right, my awareness that it is my own consciousness that provides me with a sense of truth, something more than this mere certainty. sense certainty. This does not end my search for truth. And this is a stage in the development of truth. And what this sets up instead is now uh, a more complicated interplay, a more complicated dialectic between self consciousness, which has this abstract notion of truth about the external world, and uh, the otherness that continues uh, to reveal itself in externality, in uh, in the object. I have a notion of the abstract object. I have an understanding of the truth of the object as abstract as it's given to consciousness in itself. But obviously, right, my notion, this truth, doesn't grasp uh, externality completely. It provides me with a sense uh, of an essence. The thing is essentially, uh, we'd say, right, a substance. Right? There is a substance that all of these qualities and properties belong to. Right? I understand the object as substance. That substance is the abstract truth, consciousness in itself, right? A form, uh, an idea, to use Plato's language, that is the higher truth that explains all these different moments of sense certainty. My self consciousness grasps then that the external thing is primarily a conscious thing, uh, is this essence, right? Form. But these essences um, don't exhaust the possibility of understanding. When I grasp the essence of a thing, for example, if I grasp it as form, um, I'm going to return to the object and realize that that essence has its own shortcomings in my encounter, my grasp of the external thing. Right? So we can think of this as the transition from Plato to Aristotle. Plato grasps the essence of the external thing as idea, as form. Right? Consciousness in itself reduces the external thing uh, to a function of consciousness, and um, right, that is the truth. Now, excuse me. When then we move to some other philosophy, right? When we move to Aristotle, Aristotle will critique this whole idea of essences. Right? Aristotle will return to uh, the external world, right? To say, as we, well, to say, right, the truth isn't just in the essence, the idea, but the truth is requires the external thing, the external being. Anyway, we haven't done enough Aristotle to make that an important example, but for those of you who know your ancient philosophy. As we continue to probe the relationship between our notion of the external world and the external world itself, we find that the essences that we give are not uh, absolute comprehensive understandings of the external world, but are instead as he says, moments of self consciousness. He says, the mere being, this is on page 105, the mere being of what is merely meant, the singleness and the universality opposed to it of perception, as also the empty inner being of the understanding. These are no longer essences, but are moments of self consciousness, i.e., abstractions or distinctions which at the same time have no reality for consciousness itself and are purely vanishing essences. Thus, it seems that the only principal movement itself has been lost, viz., the simple self subsistent existence for consciousness. These essences uh, are impermanent. And what we determine the essence of a thing to be um, will be only a moment of our understanding of our consciousness. I say the essence is this, but on further investigation, right, that essence is insufficient. That essence doesn't explain everything, so I have to come up with a new essence. And then he says, but in point of fact, self consciousness is the reflection out of the being of the world of sense and perception, and is essentially the return from otherness. As self consciousness, it is movement. But since what it distinguishes from itself is only itself as itself, the difference as an otherness is immediately superseded for it. The difference is not, and it, self consciousness, is only the motionless tautology of I am I. But since for it the difference does not have the form of being, it is not self consciousness. Hence, otherness is for it in the form of a being or as a distinct moment. But there is also for self consciousness the unity of itself with this difference as a second distinct moment. With that first moment, self consciousness is in the form of consciousness, and the whole expanse of the sensuous world is preserved for it. At the same time, only as connected with the second moment, the unity of self consciousness with itself. And hence, the sensuous world is for it an enduring existence, which, however, is only appearance, or a difference which in itself is no difference. So, this is this back and forth that consciousness does between the sensuous world of experience, of perception, and of consciousness. That self consciousness is the consciousness of this back and forth, this continual testing of notion against experience, which is itself, right, the movement of self consciousness, insofar as, right, from here on out, once consciousness becomes aware of itself as that which provides truth to the external world, then all further modifications of the notion and idea of the external world can be understood as self consciousness interrogating itself, interrogating its own understanding, its own notion, and its own awareness of the external world. Right? The consciousness of the external world, consciousness of perception, perception itself are immediately mediated by this self consciousness that understands those as moments now of self consciousness, right? Revising its own grasp of the world, getting a better grasp of the world. This antithesis of its appearance and its truth, that which forces us to revise our notions of the truth, has, however, for its essence only the truth, viz., the unity of self consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self consciousness. i.e., self consciousness is desire in general. Now, this is uh, interesting that what this level of truth brings us is a kind of will to truth, a desire for truth. That self consciousness uh, becomes or is desire, in that what it is this movement toward ever greater knowledge and understanding, ever greater grasp of the external world and of itself within that external world. That self consciousness wants now to complete its grasp of the external world, to complete itself. uh, so that now self consciousness is desirous of complete possession of the external world. And this self consciousness as desire, and this desire to possess the entire world, possess being through knowledge, uh, is the differentiation of self consciousness into individual beings, individual entities, into life. Uh, but for us, or in itself, the object which for self consciousness is the negative element, right, that which exceeds and escapes self consciousness, has on its side returned into itself, just as on the other side consciousness has done. Through this reflection into itself, through this reflection into itself, the object has become life. What self consciousness distinguishes from itself as having being also has in it, insofar as it is posited as being, not merely the character of sense certainty and perception, but it is being that is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is the living thing. For the in itself of the universal result of the relation of the understanding to the inwardness of things is the distinguishing of what is not to be distinguished, or the unity of what is distinguished. But this unity is, as we have seen, just as much its repulsion from itself. All right, enough. Uh, this notion sunders itself into the antithesis of self consciousness and life. So, what is life at this stage? What is this object, this externality? It is the object, right? It is the object as it exists for us, for consciousness. And what is being divided is not the subject from the object in the sense of the, uh, self-consciousness separated from the object in itself, but instead is the separation of self-consciousness in itself and consciousness for itself, right? Consciousness of the object, perception. That what is now separated is uh, my own being, where I perceive myself, I understand myself to be, on the one hand, a living thing, right? And as living thing, I am object. I am engaged with the external world. I am perceiving, I am immersed in the external world, this perceiving being that receives the world, that is caught up in the world, that is part of the world. I am a living thing. And life is my being engaged with the external world through perception, through interaction. Right? Self-consciousness is that which is removed from life, is able to reflect on life. Right? So now, in my pursuit, my desire, uh, my attempt to possess the world, uh, that desire still lies on the side of self-consciousness, right? And what is negative, what that self-consciousness lacks, that is to say, what it does not possess or understand, manifests through life, through my being as engaged with the external world, as a living thing. So that now what I have is a notion about life. And life, myself as a living thing, is that which exceeds and supersedes that notion. Life at this stage is the inessential, right? Because what is essential is self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is uh, absolute grasp of being. He says, section 169, page 106, the determination of life as it has been issued from the notion, or the general result with which we enter this sphere, is sufficient to characterize it without having further to develop its nature. Its sphere is completely determined in the following moments. Essence is infinity as the supersession of all distinctions, the pure movement of axial rotation, its self-repose being an absolutely restless infinity. Independence itself, in which the differences of the movement are resolved, the simple essence of time, which, in this equality with itself, has the stable shape of space. The differences, however, are just as much present as differences in the simple universal medium. Uh, so, life, then, right, has the essence of supersession, of, as he says, right, infinite restlessness or restless infinity. Uh, Life understood from the perspective of the notion, the perspective of self-consciousness, is uh, restless infinity, that which is constantly superseding, surpassing itself. Right? Life is the kind of pure negativity to the positivity of the notion. Uh, Now, the other important, interesting moment here is, right, the distinction between uh, time and space and this language of the shape, which will return throughout this section. Right? Shape is a mode or a form of a being. Uh, like essences, things take on different shapes. And the shape of a thing will be determined by its stage of development, its stage of development in consciousness and understanding. Uh, so he says, in life, right, time has the stable shape of space. In life, time is space. Time is space means that, right, all that is, uh, sorry, all that is movement, transformation. Right? What is time as space? Change. Right? So life is change. Life is supersession, and the notion is the attempt to understand that life as change in terms of universality, in terms of abstract absoluteness. What this constant supersession and transformation that is the change of life can be reduced to is the notion of difference, of otherness. What does life mean to self consciousness in this mode, in this moment? It means the reception of differences, of otherness that challenge the notion of life, that which forces us to revise our notion. So, what provides this difference and this otherness is not, again, the external world, the thing in itself, but is still the movement between self consciousness uh, as notion and self consciousness as life. Right? Is still this inner dividedness, the dividedness of consciousness from itself, that is ultimately the source of this difference and otherness. This supersession, he writes on 107, is just as much within the shape itself. For it is just that flux which is the substance of the independent shape. This substance, however, is infinite, and hence the shape in its very subsistence is a dividedness within itself, or a supersession of its being for self. Right? That uh, consciousness of life is still consciousness superseding itself, dividing itself. So that all transformation and all change is at this stage of development understood to lie externally, to belong to the external world. All right. So I think this is just a very interesting analysis of the meaning of life, right? Uh, as a concept in the development of knowledge, the development of consciousness. Let me just quote one more, a few more sections of this, right? He writes on 108. Life, not what was expressed at the outset, the immediate continuity and compactness of its essence, nor the enduring form, the discrete moment existing for itself, nor the pure process of these, nor yet the simple taking together of these moments. Life consists rather in being the self-developing whole, which dissolves itself, which dissolves its development, and in this moment simply preserves itself. Life points to something other than itself, viz., to consciousness, for which life exists as this unity or as this genus. Right? That life as such only exists for consciousness. Right? I think this is exactly right. Uh, we're able to regard life not as that which totalizes our being, but as an aspect of our being. Right? That we are something more than simply living beings, and that something more can only be understood as consciousness of some kind. So let's make a transition then to our next discussion about lordship and bondage. Life is understood as the negation, the site of negation of the notion and of consciousness. He writes on 109, going on to 110, since the object is its own self-negation, and in being so is at the same time independent, it is consciousness. Right? In the sphere of life, which is the object of desire, negation is present either in another, viz., in desire, or as a determinateness opposed to another indifferent form, or as the inorganic universal nature of life. But this universal independent nature in which negation is present as absolute negation is the genus as such, or the genus as self-consciousness. Self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. The notion of self-consciousness is only completed in these three moments. The pure undifferentiated I is its first immediate object. But this immediacy is itself an absolute mediation. It is only as a supersession of the independent object. In other words, it is desire. Right? So sense certainty meets, right, is raised to the next level of uh, self-consciousness, which is the desire to uh, have the truth of sense certainty at an abstract level. Satisfaction of desire is, it is true, the reflection of self-consciousness into itself, or the certainty that has become truth. And then finally, C, but the truth of this certainty is really a double reflection, the duplication of self-consciousness. Consciousness has for its object one which, of its own self, posits its otherness or difference as a nothingness, and in so doing is independent. The differentiated, merely living shape does indeed also supersede its independence in the process of life, but it ceases with its distinctive difference to be what it is. Right? Uh, Now, this life as the negation of notion again reveals itself to be its opposite, right? To be self consciousness itself developing itself. A self consciousness exists for a self consciousness, right? That life is not this pure negation and absolute difference, this independent object, but is again revealed to be uh, the in itself, not just the for itself. It is revealed itself to be self consciousness. And in this moment, right, we arrive at the notion of not a notion of life, but with the true recognition of self consciousness that is not opposed to life, but once life itself is revealed to be a mode of self consciousness, then we see self consciousness again become uh, the unity of both thinking, reflection, and living. This unity is what Hegel calls spirit. He writes, self consciousness, uh, in being an object, right, as life, is just as much I as object. With this, we already have before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self consciousnesses, which, in their opposition, enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I, that is we, and we, that is I. Right? Self consciousness understands itself to be multiple, uh, understands for the first time the unity between I and object. And this unity is the unity of spirit. It's spirit which grasps itself as the ground of both subject, notion, and object or life. The I, then, which formerly lay on the side of the notion, becomes multiple, no longer just self consciousness of reflection, but equally its opposite. I becomes bifurcated, as we discussed in class, right? Self consciousness is the I that surpasses itself, that departs from itself, the I that is not unified. Uh, and this I now, as spirit, or rather, spirit, is that that bifurcated I, that non-self same I. The I is a we. The we is an I. So that my identity, my unity, my being is not singular, is not independent in this sense that, of self consciousness and the notion. I am multiple. I am not singular. Uh, and in this non singularity, in the recognition that I am not a one, but I am this self-surpassing. Uh, Not only do I recognize the inadequacy of an understanding of myself as a simple subject, simple observing rationality, but I also, right, uh, arrive at kind of confusion about what distinguishes me as an I from a you as an I, another self consciousness as another human being, as another life form. Uh, and this is a first recognition of spirit, because for Hegel, spirit can be individuated as an individual I. Uh, but spirit is also the collection of I's, the collection of people. Right? Spirit is not just the spirit of the individual, but the spirit of humanity, the spirit of all people. So this, confusion about I and we, I think is really interesting. Uh, and, I think we could sort of step back from Hegel and say, well, think about what is the unity of myself as a thinking thing. This was always something that we had trouble with Descartes, right? Uh, and it's one of the problems that Cartesian philosophy in general tries to deal with. I think, therefore I am. There is thinking. Thoughts come to me, right? Um, what unifies those thoughts? How do I say uh, that one thought, that all the thoughts I have are mine? Right? Uh, and we think about this sort of casually. What is the makeup of your consciousness? Uh, how many ideas can you say are genuinely your own? Um, Hegel's point would be all ideas are constructed, constructed dialectically. Uh, and that when we're thinking, we're constantly thinking a collection of other people's thoughts. When I think, I'm thinking using other people's thoughts, ideas that have been given to me by other people, ideas that arise through uh, interactions with other people, with books, through history. So that my experience of thinking as my own thinking is kind of inadequate, right? And this is what he's going to get into in just a moment, right? That this self-consciousness, that is desire of knowledge, uh, grasps thinking as my thinking, and grasps everything that is thought as my own possession. Right? That as I understand things, they become mine. Uh, that through thinking, I think of myself and my world and my grasp of the world. But this is only at the level of individuated spirit, spirit as the individual. Already implanted in self-consciousness inherently is an understanding that will surpass this understanding of individuated spirit, right? In which I can understand thinking, self-consciousness, not as mine, but as a product of the collective spirit. And it is the beginning of our understanding of collective spirit that brings us to this famous section on lordship and bondage. Uh, Lordship and bondage discusses the relationship between two self-consciousnesses, two, as it were, independent self-consciousnesses, two different people. And it's about the relationship not just between two different people, but the way the relationship between people is mediated through a third term, through the object, through externality. So, in part A of self-consciousness, independence and dependence of self-consciousness, lordship and bondage, Hegel begins with a concept of acknowledgement and recognition. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it exists, that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged. Right? We can think about that in relation to the concept of self-consciousness or emerging out of consciousness also. The notion of this, its unity, in its duplication, embraces many and varied meanings. Right? It finds its unity in its duplication. Unity of self-consciousness, the being of self-consciousness, can only emerge through its duplication, its multiplication, its self-division. Unity implies self-division. The twofold significance of the distinct moments, right, this division, has in the nature of self-consciousness to be infinite or directly the opposite of the determinateness in which it is posited. The detailed exposition of the notion of this spiritual unity in its duplication will present us with the process of recognition. That self-consciousness, because it is duplication, because it is inherently multiple, requires recognition. Self-consciousness must be recognized by other self-consciousnesses. And so this is, really complicated thought, I think, at the first level, the level of self-consciousness for itself. Let's press on. Self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. Self-consciousness comes out of itself. It's coming out of itself. It faces itself. This has a twofold significance. First, it has lost itself, for it finds itself in another being. Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the first sees its own self. So let's just think about this, not at the level of self consciousness within the individual, but of two different people with self consciousness. At this level, self consciousness arises through a separate consciousness. Here we transcend the borders of individuated consciousness, uh, so that one individuated consciousness confronts another individuated consciousness. Two people meet, right? They face each other. And the language of the face here is interesting. Right? One recognizes consciousness behind another human being through the face of another human. And this consciousness of the other, right, is recognized by my consciousness as another consciousness. Consciousness recognizes consciousness. Consciousness, then, the one, the first self consciousness, feels it has lost itself, right? Because self consciousness is that desire for possession of life and of being, of knowledge of the world. It views the external as its object, as its possession. When it views another self consciousness that also views that same external world as its own, another consciousness that desires the external world and to possess the external world, right? It feels it has lost itself. It realizes that the external world is not its own inherently, but there are others uh, for whom the external world is also a possession, uh, also its own object. So it loses itself. Uh, and then, secondly, right, it recognizes or it sees, feels, it understands that the other consciousness is inessential. Right? The other is pursuing their own possession, but their pursuit does nothing for me. Right? That is self consciousness. That other being has self consciousness. It is like me, it is a doubling of me, but is inessential because its pursuit provides nothing for consciousness, for my consciousness. And because self consciousness as desire at this level, which views the external world as its object, uh, desires total possession, the complete belonging of the object to itself. It views this other self consciousness as not only unessential to that project of possession, but also uh, as something that needs to be overcome, surpassed, and superseded. The other self consciousness needs to be subordinated to it. it must supersede this otherness of itself. This is the supersession of the first ambiguity, and and is therefore itself a second ambiguity. The first moment is ambiguous. There are two self-consciousnesses. How do I understand this other self-consciousness? I have to escape this ambiguity by overcoming it. First, it must proceed to supersede the other independent being in order thereby to become certain of itself and the essential being. Secondly, in so doing, it proceeds to supersede its own self, for this other is itself. Okay, so in order to become certain of myself as the proper self-consciousness, I have to overcome the other self-consciousness, right? In order to assure myself that I really am what I think I am, this self-conscious being. But in this supersession of the other, in order to secure myself as the proper self-consciousness for whom the external world properly exists, I have to turn myself into something else in relation to that other self-consciousness. Because if I remain merely identical to that other self-consciousness, then I can't be sure that the external world is really for me. Now, Hegel writes, this movement of self-consciousness in relation to another self-consciousness has in this way been represented as the action of one self-consciousness. But this action of the one has itself the double significance of being both its own action and the action of the other as well. At this level, I act, and I act on and in relation to the other. I enter into social political relationships, right? That's action. It's something more than my engagement and involvement with the external world. Action is for and through an other self-consciousness. When I act, then, therefore, my action is always, because it is through and in relation to the other, an action that is reflected in the other also. For the other is equally independent and self-contained, and there's nothing in it of which it is not itself the origin. The first does not have the object before it merely as it exists primarily for desire, but is something that has an independent existence of its own, which therefore it cannot utilize for its own purposes. So this other, which is self-contained, I think the idea here, right, is that that action inherently involves the other, and the other, as independent, will react to that action in some certain way. So the action provokes a reaction. The action always involves the other and promises an action from the other. Thus, through action, these two self-consciousnesses recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. When one acts, the other reacts. This is an action of self-consciousness, in that it establishes each for the other as a proper self-consciousness capable of action. Now, he writes on page 113, each is indeed certain of its own self, but not of the other. For it would have truth, but not of the other, and therefore its own self-certainty still has no truth. Fascinating, right? This self-certainty of myself as consciousness, as self-consciousness, uh, is in fact not true until it has been demonstrated in another. I believe myself to be independent. I believe myself to be capable of action and to be uh, this self-conscious being that has the external world as its object. But that notion of the self is certain, but doesn't have truth because it hasn't been abstracted. In order for it to be abstracted, that same independence and capacity for action would need to be demonstrated in another self-consciousness, another independent being. So that my own self-certainty as self-consciousness will ultimately only find truth through the demonstration of that independence and power in another self-consciousness, right? Uh, I only really know what I'm capable of, or I know what I'm capable of through observing others. I know what my being and consciousness are and can be through others. However, in this initial confrontation between self-consciousnesses, there is struggle. The initial impulse is not to validate oneself through the other, but rather, well, the initial impulse is to validate oneself through the other, but the first manner of self-validation through the other is through domination, through dominance. Right? I can only be what I am by superseding and dominating the other. So Hegel writes, the bottom of 113, thus the relation of the two self-conscious individuals is such that they prove themselves and each other through a life and death struggle. They must engage in this struggle, for they must raise their certainty of being for themselves to truth, both in the case of the other and in their own case. And it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won. Only thus is it proved that for self-consciousness, its essential being is not just being, not the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather that there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as a vanishing moment, that it is only pure being for itself. So, to prove its freedom, its independence, it has to enter into this life and death struggle with the other. Right? Now, the central way this independence is demonstrated or is achieved is through literal domination, through action. Right? In this life and death struggle, what is realized is that life is as essential as self-consciousness. Self-consciousness needs life. Life is not the negativity of self-consciousness, but life is essential to the being of self-consciousness. That in being threatened with death by an other, self-consciousness recognizes that it needs life in order to be. In this experience, self-consciousness learns that life is as essential to it as pure self-consciousness. Right? And in clinging to life, one enters into relationships of domination. Since to begin with, they are unequal and opposed. Right? These two self-consciousnesses, the one that regards itself as the essential and proper self-consciousness, and the other which is regarded by the first as unessential, as essentially an object. Since then, for each self-consciousness, the relationship between consciousness is at the beginning unequal and opposed, the one being immediate, the other being a form of thinghood. Since to begin with they are unequal and opposed, the relation and the reflection into a unity has not yet been achieved. They exist as two opposed shapes of consciousness. One is the independent consciousness whose essential nature is to be for itself. The other is the dependent consciousness whose essential nature is simply to live or to be for the other. The former is Lord, the other is bondsman. So that these consciousnesses enter into a literal confrontation, a literal life and death struggle, in which each sees the other as unessential. Now, whoever wins in that life and death struggle will assert themselves as the proper dominant term, right? The true self-consciousness, that self-consciousness which properly is in and for itself. And the other self-consciousness will be subjugated, right? Will exist for an other, right? And only for another. And Hegel goes on to say, right, the Lord is the consciousness that exists for itself, but no longer merely the notion of such consciousness. Rather, it is a consciousness existing for itself, which is mediated with itself through another consciousness, i.e., through a consciousness whose nature it is to be bound up with an existence that is independent, or thinghood in general. The Lord is the consciousness that wins the life and death struggle and dominates the other. Its lordship is expressed through forcing the other to relate to the external world. That the other becomes, for the Lord, a means of mediation, a mediation between the Lord, which is now consciousness, the absolute consciousness for itself of self-consciousness. And that pure self-consciousness is mediated, its relationship to the external world is mediated now by the bondsman, the person that loses this life or death struggle. The bondsman is enslaved. The bondsman is the servant, the serf, the slave, the person who is in bondage. And so Hegel is now discussing an actual social political relationship, where what happens is we get a social hierarchy based on this domination which occurs through the shared medium of these two self-consciousnesses, through life, through engagement with the material physical world, with the object. The Lord, this section of phenomenology is also referred to as the master-slave dialectic. The master, the Lord, now relates to the external world through the slave, through the bondsman, through labor, the labor of the bondsman. The bondsman now works the earth, right? Farms for the Lord, serves the Lord, right? Everything that the Lord as self-consciousness formerly had to do for themselves in going out into the world and living life, the engagement with the external world that is life. All that is now done for the Lord by the bondsman. The bondsman is the Lord's intermediary and serves the Lord as the Lord used to serve himself. The bondsman then is, in this relationship, at first the inessential term. Right? The Lord is the one that is truly for himself, and the Lord's relationship to the external world remains the same, but is now mediated by the bondsman. Now, the Lord in this case has absolute freedom in the first moment, because the Lord is entirely for himself and everything is done by the bondsman. The Lord is genuinely independent and the bondsman is entirely dependent. Now, as Hegel says, right, all of this happens at an early stage in self-consciousness's confrontation with another self-consciousness, a stage before which the unity of the two self-consciousnesses is actually achieved. The separation, the absolute separation between Lord and bondsman, the independence and freedom and for itselfness of the Lord, and its opposition, the absolute dependence and lack of freedom of the bondsman, is only the first moment in the dialectical relationship between these two self-consciousnesses. What happens is that as this relationship develops, the Lord becomes increasingly realizes that in fact they are the unessential relationship moment in this framework. That the Lord, by relegating all work, all labor on the external world to the bondsman, has in fact cut himself off from the external world. And in so doing, has lost his genuine relationship to the external world and thereby lost his genuine independence. So we can think of this in terms of master-slave dialectic relationship. The Lord, at first, realizes, well, right, the Lord is the Lord at first, uh, because all the benefit of the slave's work goes to the Lord. The Lord gets all the benefits from the dependent slave's work, and the bondsman, has no independent existence. All their labor uh, benefits only the Lord. But the next moment here is the realization that the Lord is nothing without the bondsman. The master is nothing without the slave. That all of the wealth and power, the very independence of the master, is in fact entirely dependent on the work of the bondsman, work of the slave. Right? That without the bondsman, the Lord is nothing. And therefore, right, this begins the reversal of this relationship, where the master realizes that they have become entirely dependent on the bondsman, that without the bondsman, they are nothing. The bondsman also recognizes that they are themselves uh, in an independent relationship with the external world. Right? Their work is their own work, and that the master is also entirely dependent on them. And so we get this reversal where now the bondsman becomes the essential moment, uh, the truly independent one, and the Lord and master becomes the dependent one, the unessential moment. This reversal uh, leads to the dissolution of the relationship, right? Where with this reversal, uh, the dialectical relationship between lordship and bondage is moved beyond. And now both self consciousnesses recognize themselves as each uh, being independent, each having their own relationship to the external world, and understanding that that relationship to the external world is always mediated through the other self consciousness. And in this, they become independent. So, this Hegelian discussion of lordship and bondage gets taken up by um, a lot of 20th century thinkers about the relationship between colonizer and colonized, between, right, masters and slaves. And Hegel's idea is, right, freedom can only come through the independent challenge to the master on the part of the slave, the independent challenge of the Lord by the bondsman. Uh, and this ultimate freedom and the ultimate dissolution of this hierarchical relationship and domination can only come when the dependent, the bondsman, recognizes their true power and recognizes the dependence of the Lord, and thus is able to overcome them. All right, so we're over time. That will do it for today. And we will next time get more into reason uh, and hopefully talk a little bit more about the lordship and bondage section. Okay, till then.